So my book is structured around 7 chapters because obviously 7 is God's number. So any good book will have 7 chapters. And I speak in jest, but it's an important outline because starting off in chapter 1, we have kind of a history of baptism, although most books that study about baptism are essentially really well versed in studying the history. So I don't study the history for history's sake. I mainly study the issue of how faith and baptism relate or how they're linked. And so in chapter 1, we talk about how historically the church has always recognized faith and baptism are supposed to go hand in hand. And it only happened later during the Reformation when you really started to get a push where baptism and faith are suddenly viewed as distinct or separated. And so in chapter 1, we call to mind the question, why are we trying to separate faith and baptism? It ought to go together. So then in order to understand that from the Reformed perspective, I go into their arguments. And I think it's very helpful to understand from one's own words what they believe. So I go into the Reformed views of covenant theology, why the covenant of grace is so essential to the issue of baptism. We talk about how covenant theology's view of Israel and the church being essentially identical contributes to their understanding of baptism. And then we also talk about what is the primary argument, at least biblically speaking, for Reformed covenant theology, and that's circumcision. So in the Reformed viewpoint, circumcision and baptism are essentially equal. That's the word that they use. They're essentially equal. Baptism has replaced circumcision. And so that's a very big chapter because it has to be. We're talking about their argument that is circumcision and is baptism the same? And going through that, I try to show that they're not the same. And there are quite a few differences. And then so after we talk about circumcision, we talk about one of the final arguments that Reformed Paedo-Baptists often use with regard to household baptisms and the corporate nature of the family. And although there's much to appreciate with regard to the Reformed view of the family, I think that this is one area where I think scriptures talk a little bit differently about what God does with individuals and households and how that interacts. And so I try to deal a lot with the Reformed arguments. As Doug Wilson even says, the debate about infant baptism is actually a debate about children. And so that's one of the issues we really try to delve into in chapter 6. And then after covering all of that, so if you think about chapters 2 through 6, those are essentially dealing with the Reformed understanding of infant baptism. And then in chapter 7, I go into what Matt Waymeyer calls the best argument against infant baptism, and that's what does the New Testament say baptism is all about? And so when we go into that, I think that you walk away from that study saying the New Testament doesn't speak ambiguously about baptism. It speaks very clearly about what baptism is. And the big question is, can that apply to infants?